Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Deputy Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and co-host of the 35 West podcast.
With how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director with the Americas Program at CSIS and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. The re-election of President Donald Trump in the United States has sent reverberations throughout Mexico and Canada, the U.S.'s closest neighbors and largest trading partners. Of particular concern is President Trump's threats to impose tariffs on Canadian exports into the United States, a move which would not only apply significant pressure on the Canadian economy, but would be in contravention of the U.S Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement that Trump negotiated during his first term to replace NAFTA. The threat of tariffs will undoubtedly color U.S Canada relations to come and provides an insight into the likely directions of a Trump administration trade policy, which will likely emphasize striking an accord on sensitive issues like trade deficits, border security, and defense. How this relationship evolves will also be especially important as we approach the 2026 joint review of the USMCA, which may see points of friction on the part of all three parties serve to undermine the agreement. For this reason, CSIS recently launched a new USMCA strategic initiative aimed at mobilizing thought leadership around the 2026 joint review and discussing some of the challenges and opportunities facing all three countries. Today, we will delve into the implications of President Trump's re-election for U.S.-Canada relations with Dr. Meredith Lilly, Professor and Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University, and former Foreign Affairs and International Trade Advisor to Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Thank you for joining us today, Meredith.
Thanks so much for the invitation to be here, Chris.
It's a real pleasure to have you. Meredith, on November 25th, President Trump announced he planned to impose a 25% tariff on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico, unless both countries worked to curb irregular migration and the flow of illicit drugs to the United States. Could you sketch a scene setter for our audience? What reaction did this threat provoke from the Canadian side? And what, in your opinion, does it signal for future U.S.-Canada relations in particular?
So when this tweet was issued, it really did send shockwaves and reverberations through Canada. And I think there was initially a mix of reactions. On the one hand, there was, I think, a sense of disbelief and kind of immediate dismissal that this could possibly happen. But I think this time Canadians are aware that President Trump has made good on threats in the past. And so there was also, I think, a real worry on the part of private sector as well as government, obviously. It caused quite a bit of concern. I think the other thing that a lot of Americans don't realize is that every time a U.S. president mentions the word Canada or any Canadian leader, it immediately becomes front page news here in a way that I don't think always happens on the other side of the border. And so this ran headlines for a week in Canada. I'm not sure that's particularly helpful for Canadians because I think it does play into a playbook that President Trump knows and likes well, which is seeking media attention to advance his agenda. And so in that way, I don't know that it really helped Canadians that we spent so much time thinking about this issue. At the same time, there was a sense that he's serious and that this is something that we need to treat seriously. And so there has been a lot of follow-on from that we can get into if you like. But I think in terms of what does this signal for future Canada-US relations, I think it definitely sent a signal to Canadians that we should not expect business as usual and that we're in for, I think, a rocky ride for the next few years.
Canada and the U.S., owing to their shared history, deep cultural, economic, and institutional ties, and sheer geographic closeness, are deeply affected by developments on either side of the border, particularly, I've just pointed out, on the Canadian side of the border. This makes navigating a more tumultuous trading relationship a challenge, but it also offers a deep wellspring of collaboration to draw upon in order to find productive solutions. The initial tariff announcement has been made in connection with stemming the flow of migrants and drugs into the U.S. What will it take for the United States to declare a win and not impose the tariffs on January 20th?
We don't really know the answer to that in Canada, but I think that what Canadians should be doing is defining that for ourselves. So, obviously, President Trump and his team will have their own views about what is a win, and they will hopefully make that known at some point. But in the meantime, I think that Canada shouldn't just wait to be told that what we've done is sort of enough, that tariffs won't be imposed. So I think there's a few things that we should be doing regardless. So the first thing is that we should be treating the threat as a real one. And so if illicit crossings, either from the United States into Canada or from Canada into the United States, is a real concern for the administration, then that's something that we should deal with. And we do know that there has been a little bit of an uptick in the last few years, and there's definitely things that we can be doing on that side. When it comes to illicit crossings, Canada should be addressing the number of irregular migrants that are present in the United States and may be coming to Canada. So that is something that we should address regardless, because we do have the world's longest territorial border between our two countries, and there's a lot of territory that we could increase our security around. I think on the fentanyl side of things, fentanyl from Canada into the United States, I think, represents a very small problem. At the same time, Canada does have challenges in our own cities with illicit drugs, including fentanyl. And so that's something that we should be addressing for its own sake. And those are measures we should be taking. And the Trudeau government has made it clear that they will spend up to potentially $1 billion on enforcement at the border, including drones and helicopters and a variety of things to increase security at the border. So that's all great. At the same time, there is some concern in Canada that the threat around the border is not entirely really about the border. Certainly, there are concerns about Canada's NATO spending. I share those concerns and do believe that Canada needs to be doing its part. So not only committing the money, but also procuring resources and spending it. There are many in Canada that share that view with me. And so that's something that we're all looking to the government to increase action on. But then finally, it's been floated several times by future representatives of the Trump administration, nominees to cabinet, that some of the tariff threat may really be about raising revenues to offset tax cuts in the United States. And if that is a genuine plan by the Trump administration, it actually makes it quite difficult for Canada to maneuver that, because that's a domestic issue in the United States, and there's very little that Canada can do on that front. So that's a real concern, and something that we also have to be aware of in our minds and be thinking about how we might potentially treat unfair rules being placed on Canada around tariffs if this is really about a completely different game altogether.
I'll get back to you on the question of defense spending as sort of a collateral irritant, particularly in the context of, I guess, what we can call a looming Canadian election. But for now, back to the question of tariffs. Should the United States follow through on its pledge to apply tariffs, or some version thereof, perhaps slightly less than 25%? What sectors of Canada's economy will be most impacted? And what will this mean for business and consumers on both sides of the border, given the deep integration between the two countries?
This would be really, really disruptive for businesses and consumers on both sides of the border. So it's important for listeners to be aware that upwards of 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. There's a real asymmetry there, though, because while Canada is also the number one export destination for the United States, American exports to Canada represent only about 15% of U.S. exports. And so that asymmetry is something that is not lost on the administration in this. Now, if it's an across-the-board tariff of 25%, that will impact all sectors of the Canadian economy. But in particular, it will have major effects on energy, advanced manufacturing, particularly auto parts and vehicles, and also some other notable sectors, things like potash exports, where, for instance, the United States, upwards of 80% of its imports of potash come from Canada, come from the province of Saskatchewan. It takes millions of years for potash to develop. And so the United States doesn't have a lot of other options unless it wants to import potash from Russia. And so, that's the kind of example where if US importers are price sensitive, then they may depress their demand for Canadian exports, which would then place pressure on Canadian firms to lower their prices for those kinds of exports. But that really only works if there is either, a major profit markup where Canadian firms could dip into those profits, or where US importers can find alternate suppliers. But in the case of something like potash that I just mentioned, that's not likely to be possible. And so what that means is that 25% tariff is paid for entirely by US importers, who are mostly farmers, and that will drive up the cost of food. It also will actually exacerbate the size of the trade imbalance between Canada and the United States, because the cost of all these things will go up for Americans, which will only make that trade imbalance worse. So it really does depend on the goods impacted and on the flexibility of supply chains by Americans. But for Canada, if it's across the board, everything that we're exporting to the United States, that represents many, many sectors. When it comes to vehicles, this would be really, really complicated, because on average, a vehicle, when it is being built by, for instance, the big three down in the Detroit-Windsor area, those vehicles essentially cross the border 7 or 8 times before they're finished. And so if we're talking about potential tariffs on unfinished products several times back and forth across the border, this would just be a nightmare for both sides. So it'll be costly. It will increase both tariff barriers, but then also just the processing of how the tariff is being managed as it goes back and forth across the border. And that will just increase costs for everyone. It will be bad for everyone. And then again, on the energy side, it's very unlikely that Canadian energy being exported to the United States is going to be offered at a discount in order to offset that tariff. We'll just send it elsewhere instead. And so that, again, will increase costs for Americans filling up their cars with gasoline and that kind of thing. So we're talking about major, major disruption and major costs to businesses and citizens on both sides of the border.
Meredith, you mentioned potash. President Trump, during his first administration, made critical minerals an important initiative, given China's dominance of many critical minerals, its ability to control prices, to impose export bans, and the like. Wouldn't this be another area that would be severely impacted, given Canada's supply of a number of critical minerals to the United States?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, this is unpleasant talk, and it's not the way that we like to operate in Canada. But if we're being threatened with a major tariff, then we have to look at all points of leverage in Canada. China has already signaled that it is going to start reducing and or banning the export of specific critical minerals. And it's doing that for geopolitical reasons and to try to attain leverage over the United States around tariff plans. And so one of the logical places to look for some of those critical minerals will be Canada. So in order for the United States to have partners in its attempts to constrain China and in its work around U.S.-China competition, the United States needs friends in that. And Canada has indicated that we are a friend and an ally when it comes to addressing China. We have placed the same tariffs on steel, aluminum, and electric vehicles coming from China. We have been lockstep with the United States on that. It really would be best in the area of critical minerals and other things that the United States can turn to Canada as a source. But in order for that to happen, the United States needs to be a good friend to Canada as well. And so I have no doubt that things like critical minerals will be part of the conversation if the tariffs should actually be applied.
I want to turn to some of the trade and business issues beyond sort of the threats of tariffs, but some concrete trade and business issues that have become irritants in the U.S. Canada trading relationship. For instance, Canada's relatively new Digital Services Tax or the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, especially as AI should be an area of strong collaboration between the two countries. What options exist for the United States and Canada to work together on addressing some of these challenges?
There certainly are several areas of irritant in the digital space between the two countries. The digital services tax is one. The United States, under the Biden administration, has taken the view that Canada is discriminating against U.S. firms, largely because there is a minimum threshold before this tax applies. And what that means is the minimum threshold, by and large, affects U.S. firms, and other firms are exempt from the tax as a result. I tend to share the view that Canada is discriminating against U.S. firms because of the way that that tax is operating. And so removal of the threshold would be one way to address it. But, that's under the Biden administration, which is on its way out. I think that under the incoming Trump administration, the digital services tax will be handled quite differently. The Biden administration also declined to engage in enforcement with other countries that have digital services taxes, including France and others, whereas the previous Trump administration, before leaving office, was prepared to retaliate against France and other countries that were bringing in digital services taxes. And so I anticipate that that is something that will become more of an irritant in the months ahead. And it is something that I think Canada should be working with the United States on. And there are ways through the USMCA to address that particular irritant. Another area where I anticipate greater problems with the incoming administration than have been so far include something called the Online Streaming Act, which places taxes on firms that are exporting content, streaming content to Canadians. And the USMCA has rules around that would say that these kinds of taxes are a violation of USMCA. Canada's position has been that our cultural exemption under the USMCA allows us to impose these taxes and fees on firms and to prioritize Canadian content over American content. I don't think that that position is going to satisfy the Trump administration, and it is something that I think is going to come up in the USMCA. On AI more broadly, though, I do think this is an area where we should have a continental approach, a North American approach to AI. Digital services as well as AI are going to form such an important part of the future economy. They're already doing that. And so I think it's important actually for us to work together and have a common set of rules. Canada has some incredible leaders in the field of AI, Nobel Prize winners. And so, this is an area where I think it would be natural for us to be working together to address the challenges rather than allowing anything in this space to become an irritant.
Meredith, you mentioned different approaches depending on which party's in power. Canada will hold elections next year, at the latest by October 2025, with most observers predicting a spring election. With the governing Liberal Party under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau significantly behind in the polls to the Conservatives led by Pierre Poilievre, how might trade relations with the United States differ under Poilievre government? How might some of the collateral irritants, such as security at the border or low Canadian defense spending, which you mentioned earlier, be handled differently by the Conservatives should they win the election?
It is true that we're going to have an election sometime in the next year. And I think until that election happens, it does make it difficult for the three countries to engage in negotiations in a number of areas, because to most observers, it is expected that Prime Minister Trudeau will not be reelected and will be replaced by the Conservative opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre. And so in areas where the two parties, or the Liberal government and the potentially incoming Conservative government, have similar positions around trade, I don't think that you'll see major differences. But in areas where there are likely to be real differences, then that makes it difficult to engage in those kinds of discussions. So some of the differences that we expect certainly will be around the Online Streaming Act, digital services tax. These are the Online Streaming Act, as well as something called the Online News Act in Canada. These are pieces of legislation that Mr. Poilievre has said that he would repeal if elected. He has also indicated that he will overhaul the Canadian tax system, so it would be expected that a digital services tax would become part of a review of that. So, these are areas where we can expect differences of approach. Mr. Poilievre has also said that he would match any commitments being made by the Trudeau government around defense. But I think overall, in the past, conservative governments have been more willing to spend on defense than we've seen out of Mr. Trudeau's government. And I also think that there is a different approach to some of the specific concerns that President-elect Trump has made, including around illicit drugs, crime, and border concerns. These are all issues that Mr. Poilievre has said that he would address differently than are being addressed now. So in some ways, I think that it could make for a productive exchange with the incoming Trump administration to have a change of government. But until that happens, I think it sends confusing signals both to the Trump administration as well as to the Sheinbaum government in Mexico around the kinds of talk that you see in Canadian media around the Canada-US relationship, the Canada-Mexico relationship, because politics in Canada, domestic politics, is influencing some of what is being said in the press.
You mentioned Mexico, and we would be remiss to neglect the role that country will play in future North American trade as the third party to USMCA. And Mexico has had a complex relationship with China as of late. Meredith, how would you describe Canada-Mexico relations at present, and what are some of the pain points in the relationship? And might a more confrontational trade policy from the United States prompt more or less cooperation between the two countries?
There's a few things going on with the Canada-Mexico relationship at present. You know, a week before President Trump made the 25% tariff threat against Mexico and Canada, some provincial leaders in Canada had preemptively suggested that Canada should be negotiating a bilateral USMCA with the United States and cutting out Mexico. And that had actually created a lot of negative press and a lot of animosity and concern between Mexico and Canada, not in a really helpful way. It didn't seem to many close observers that preemptively seeking to isolate Mexico without any provocation was a very good move by Canada, given in particular that Mexico is the only other country in USMCA negotiations. And so it's never good to try and set aside someone who could potentially be helpful and a useful partner in negotiations with the Americans. Having said that, I think that a little bit of what was going on when those threats were being made was around concerns that the United States wants to go very hard under President Trump on Chinese investment in Mexico, as well as the headquartering of Chinese firms in Mexico, which are producing in Mexico and then exporting goods to the United States. So leaving that question aside, because under USMCA, at present, it is legal for Chinese firms to set up in Mexico, and provided that they meet the rule of origin by manufacturing in Mexico, those goods are legally allowed to be exported to the United States. So leaving that question aside for now, because that's really more of a U.S. Mexico irritant, I think that some of what you were hearing out of Canada was a desire to not be put into the same box with Mexico when it comes to China. So as I mentioned earlier in the interview, Canada has placed 100% tariff on Chinese EVs entering Canada. We were largely forced to do that because the same tariff that the United States had put on China was resulting in the dumping of Teslas made in China into Canada. And so we had to address that problem. But more broadly, we have made a decision in Canada that if we are being forced to make choices between the United States and China, that there is no contest and that we are firmly aligned with the United States. So I think some of what you were seeing out of Canada around Mexico was a concern that Mexico is going to have to make some difficult choices as well. At present, Mexico appears to want to kind of do the have your cake and eat it too analogy, which is something I think Canada was trying to do 10 years ago when it came to China. We wanted trade with the United States as well as trade with China. Mexico is sort of in that boat now, from my assessment. And I think Mexico is going to learn that it's going to have to make some difficult choices. And if you look at the amount of investment and trade with the United States versus China, Mexico also really doesn't have a choice. And I fully expect them to come along and focus much more concretely on the North American relationship. But in the meantime, I think that is one area where Canada has sought to differentiate itself. I think another area where Canada has been trying to differentiate itself is around the border, illicit migration, as well as drugs. But I don't know that Canada's message has been very clear around that, because President-elect Trump's 25% tariff threat essentially said the drug and migration problems are Canada's to share as well. So those are, a couple of areas of real irritants in the relationship. I would say more broadly, when it comes to trade between Canada and Mexico, it's unfortunate that we have become a little bit of a hub and spokes model in the USMCA and in the prior NAFTA. The vast majority of trade is between Mexico and the United States and between Canada and the United States. But there's actually not a lot of trade directly between Canada and Mexico outside of the auto sector in advanced manufacturing. A lot of the other trade is actually quite small and is largely in travel, tourism, and agriculture. And so in that way, it is unfortunate that Canada and Mexico don't have more at stake in their relationship with each other, because it makes it difficult to focus on that relationship in the broader USMCA negotiations. And it constantly becomes really about Canada and Mexico figuring out whether or not cooperating with each other is useful when it comes to the Americans. I guess one last area that has become quite an irritant for Canada has been that we are a major investor in Mexican energy and mining. And this is an area that is a result of the constitutional reforms under AMLO, President Lopez Obrador, many of which have been continued under President Sheinbaum. This has depressed Canada's interest in investing in Mexico in those sectors, which only serves to kind of further reduce the overall interest of the two countries in each other. And so I think that is unfortunate. So I don't have great optimism for how the relationship is going to move forward over the next few years, but I do think it is in both Mexico's and Canada's interest to work together more closely in seeking to address the Trump administration's demands, particularly around some of the recent issues.
We haven't talked about trade imbalances yet, which both Canada and Mexico have with the United States, and in fact are growing. With the USMCA review approaching in 2026, how might the Trump administration use this opportunity to renegotiate the agreement in an effort to reduce the trade imbalances? Could this lead to significant changes in the agreement?
I'm not sure that USMCA will be a great way to address trade imbalances, though I appreciate that it is a serious concern of President-elect Trump. Canada's trade imbalance with the United States is approximately 65 billion US dollars at the moment. It's not particularly bigger or smaller than in previous years. The trade imbalance has persisted for a long time. A lot of it is actually about Canadian energy exports to the United States. And so rather than using USMCA in some kind of way to address Canadian energy exports, I think what's more likely is that the United States will seek ways to incentivize more and more US domestic energy production, which would in one way reduce the dependence on Canadian energy. At the moment, many of your listeners would be aware that a lot of Canadian oil production is exclusively destined to the United States because we essentially have stranded assets when it comes to oil production. But Canada is seeking to diversify oil and gas production and will have other buyers soon in this space. And so as we're able to send our exports elsewhere, I don't know that it's a positive thing for the United States, but it would address the trade imbalance. And so if that is something that's important to President Trump, that will be a solution that is coming. It won't necessarily result in a decrease in prices for energy for Americans, but if that's not the goal, then that's not a problem. I think another area where we export quite a bit is in advanced manufacturing, particularly around autos. And we have this, very long and well-founded and integrated supply chain on autos. If there is a great deal of disruption around tariffs placed on autos, then we might begin to see the unwinding of that. That would be very negative for Canada. It would be disruptive for the economy. But again, these aren't things that I think USMCA can really address because we don't really have sectoral trade in USMCA. We have free trade in a variety of areas. So instead, I think what's more likely is if the president is to set requirements for either Canada to reduce its exports in specific areas, including energy, that would really be the only way to address those trade imbalances. But I don't think it would be positive for U.S. consumers, but it would be a solution.
So, Meredith, is there anything we didn't cover, anything else that you'd like to highlight or add to our conversation?
Well, I guess that we didn't really talk about USMCA yet, and maybe you'll be getting to that in the future podcasts. But as all of this is going on, Canada has been actively preparing for the USMCA review. The end date for having an agreement between the three countries would be July the 1st, 2026. And so if you step back from that date to everything that needs to happen in the lead up in order to get a renewal of the agreement, then it means a lot of work needs to happen between now and then. And so in Canada, we're sort of anticipating almost a soft triggering of USMCA renegotiations almost as soon as President Trump is inaugurated. So there's just the more, I guess, standard processes around the USMCA review that will need to be addressed. And it will be difficult for Canada to engage in that activity, at least in a very public way among leaders, when there is so much uncertainty and concern around tariffs and the border and negative commentary and sort of negative comments between the leaders. And so while I think that process will continue to advance at a bureaucratic level between officials, it's going to be hard to put a happy face on any of that so long as we have all of this negative stuff happening in the immediate term around the tariff threat. And it's also really hard to negotiate in good faith around a free trade agreement if we have a president placing tariffs on the other two countries. So, the overall picture of that doesn't fill me with optimism and hope. And I do have concerns about how all of this is going to roll out.
Well, we'd certainly like to have you back on the podcast to discuss how the review process shapes up. But for now, I wanted to thank you for joining us on 35 West. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Sure, it was my pleasure. And thanks very much for the opportunity.
And that's it for this week's edition of 35 West. We hope you enjoyed listening and that you'll stay tuned for future episodes.